In 1976, Schlitz was the best-selling beer in America. It outsold Budweiser. It outsold Coors. It had been brewing for 127 years, survived Prohibition, fed 2 world wars, and built an empire on a single promise: the beer that made Milwaukee famous. 5 years later, that same company would be a national punchline. Its flagship product would be physically rejected by drinkers. Its workers would walk off the job. Its CEO would air a commercial featuring a boxer threatening to punch the viewer in the face for not drinking the beer. And by 1982, the second largest brewer in America would be sold for parts. Nobody attacked Schlitz. No competitor outmaneuvered them. No regulator broke them up. Schlitz killed Schlitz in pursuit of a few extra cents per case. This is the story of the most spectacular act of corporate suicide in American beverage history. To understand how big the fall was, you have to understand how high Schlitz had climbed. Joseph Schlitz Brewing was founded in Milwaukee in 1849. By the late 19th century, it was already one of the largest breweries on earth, shipping its lager by rail to every corner of a thirsty, growing country. When the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed most of that city's local breweries, Schlitz loaded barrels onto freight cars and rolled them south to a population with no beer. That single act gave the company its slogan, the most valuable 7 words in American advertising history: the beer that made Milwaukee famous. By the 1950s, Schlitz was neck and neck with Anheuser-Busch for the #1 spot in the United States. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the two giants traded the crown back and forth. In 1976, Schlitz won. It sold more than 24 million barrels of beer that year. It operated state-of-the-art breweries in Milwaukee, Brooklyn, Los Angeles, Memphis, Tampa, and Winston-Salem. It owned a piece of nearly every American refrigerator. It was a 127-year-old institution with the gravitational pull of an oil company, and it was about to detonate itself in less than 5 years, on purpose, in pursuit of a margin point. The poison was already in the system before 1976. Throughout the early 70s, Schlitz's leadership, driven by CEO Robert Weiland Jr., became obsessed with one number: cost per barrel. Anheuser-Busch was the enemy, and the gap between them was tight. If Schlitz could brew its beer faster and cheaper than Budweiser, the logic went the margin advantage would compound into market dominance. The problem is that beer is not a spreadsheet. Beer is biology. Traditional lager brewing requires a long, slow fermentation. Schlitz's recipe historically called for a process that took weeks. Weiland's team asked a simple question: what if it didn't? They introduced a method called accelerated batch fermentation, cutting brewing time from roughly 25 days to about 15. They replaced expensive barley malt with cheaper corn syrup. They swapped out fresh hops for hop pellet extract. They added a foam stabilizer called silica gel to keep the head looking right on a shelf. On paper, it was genius. The cost per barrel dropped, the plants ran faster, capacity exploded. Wall Street cheered. The 1976 annual report glowed. Internally, executives reportedly bragged that they had reinvented brewing. What they had actually done was reinvent the molecule. Same label, same can, same advertising. Different beer. The first signs of trouble were small. Bartenders complained about poor quality. Distributors noticed flatter sales in markets that had previously been rock solid. Then in 1976, the year Schlitz hit #1, the chemistry caught up with the company in the most public way imaginable. Customers started opening bottles and finding what looked like white slime. The foam stabilizer Schlitz was using had begun reacting with proteins in the beer, forming visible flakes that floated through the bottle and gathered at the bottom like mucus. Industry insiders called it the Snot beer problem. Schlitz's lab understood what was happening. They had a fix. The foam stabilizer could be removed, but removing it meant briefly listing it on labels under new disclosure rules, and management refused. Instead, Schlitz quietly recalled approximately 10 million bottles in 1976. They tried a different chemical, the taste got worse. Drinkers in blind comparisons began describing Schlitz as harsh, thin, metallic. The company that had spent a century selling Gusto was now selling something that in some batches resembled cleaning fluid. And the worst part, the recall was a secret. Schlitz did not warn drinkers. They simply pulled product from shelves, hoping nobody would notice. The damage to trust, once consumers caught on, was permanent. By 1977, Schlitz had a problem the marketing department was supposed to solve. Sales were softening, the product was reformulated again, this time stripped down further to remove the offending stabilizer, but the taste was inconsistent batch to batch, so the company turned to advertising. In 1977, Schlitz launched what would become one of the most infamous campaigns in American television history. It was called "Drink Schlitz or I'll Kill You," though that was the internal nickname. On air, the tagline was, "You only go around once in life, so grab for all the gusto you can." The ads featured intimidating men, ex-fighters, lumberjacks, oil rig workers being asked by an off-camera narrator to give up their Schlitz and try a competitor. The men would glare at the camera, tighten their fists, refuse. The most notorious spot starred a heavyweight boxer who looked physically ready to punch the viewer through the screen. Audiences hated it. Industry surveys showed the campaign actively repelled buyers. Women, who increasingly drove household beer purchases, found the ads aggressive and threatening. Men found them ridiculous. The campaign was pulled in under a year. Internally, it became known as the Drink Schlitz or Die campaign, and it confirmed what consumers already suspected. A company that has to threaten you to drink its beer probably doesn't have a beer worth drinking. While the marketing was failing publicly, the operation was failing internally. Schlitz's relationship with its workforce, particularly at the flagship Milwaukee plant, had been deteriorating for years. The cost-cutting culture that had reshaped the recipe also reshaped the factory floor. Line speeds increased, quality control shifts were trimmed. Veteran brewmasters who had pushed back on the new fermentation process had been sidelined or pushed out. In June 1981, contract negotiations between Schlitz and its Milwaukee brewery workers collapsed. The workers walked. The strike lasted nearly 3 months. For a company already hemorrhaging market share, losing its flagship plant during peak summer beer season was catastrophic. Production shifted to other facilities, but the symbolism was devastating. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was no longer being made in Milwaukee. Local newspapers ran the obvious headline: "The beer that made Milwaukee famous had become the beer that made Milwaukee furious." By the time the strike ended, Schlitz announced it would close the original Milwaukee brewery permanently. The site that had brewed beer continuously since 1849, that had defined the city's identity for 4 generations, went dark. The plant where the slogan was born would never produce another bottle. The numbers tell the rest. In 1976, Schlitz had been the best-selling beer in America. By 1980, sales had fallen by roughly 40%. By 1981, they were collapsing further. The flagship Schlitz brand was dropping out of the top 5. Stroh's, Pabst, Miller, all of them were eating its market share. Anheuser-Busch, the rival Schlitz had spent a decade trying to undercut on cost, was pulling so far ahead that comparison was no longer meaningful. The board scrambled. They tried another reformulation. They tried new packaging. They tried positioning Schlitz Light as a comeback vehicle. Nothing worked, because the underlying problem was simple. An entire generation of American drinkers had personally experienced bad Schlitz. The product had betrayed them, and you cannot advertise your way out of a sensory memory. In 1982, the family agreed to sell. The buyer was Stroh Brewing Company of Detroit, a regional player less than a third the size of Schlitz at its peak. The price was around $500 million, a fraction of what the company had been worth 6 years earlier. Stroh kept the brand alive in name only, repositioning it as a discount beer. The 130-year-old empire that had once outsold Budweiser was absorbed, gutted, and shelved next to the bargain labels. The Schlitz collapse is taught in business schools, but most of the lessons drawn from it are too narrow. It is not really a story about beer. It is a story about what happens when finance logic is allowed to override product logic in a company that sells a sensory experience. Every decision Schlitz made during its decline was defensible on the spreadsheet. Cheaper inputs, faster cycle times, higher capacity utilization, lower labor costs, tougher advertising tone. Each individual choice looked like efficiency. Stacked together, they amounted to a company systematically removing the very things customers were paying for. Schlitz did not lose to a better competitor. It did not get disrupted by new technology. It did not fail to see a trend coming. It looked at its own product, the thing that had built a 130-year empire, and decided that the product was a cost center. The customers, of course, were paying for that cost center. They were paying for the long fermentation. They were paying for the malt and the hops. They were paying for the consistency. And when those things quietly disappeared from the bottle, the customers eventually noticed, and they did not come back. The phrase, "the beer that made Milwaukee famous," is now mostly used ironically. The brand still exists, owned today by Pabst, sold as a nostalgia product, but the empire is gone, demolished not by the market, but by its own management in roughly 60 months. Schlitz is the cleanest example we have of a company that was not killed by its enemies. It was killed by its own quarterly thinking. The recipe change happened because the math said it should. The Boxer commercial aired because the panic said it should. The strike happened because the cost discipline that had crushed the recipe had also crushed the workforce. And the fire sale happened because once trust is gone in a sensory product, no marketing budget can rebuild it. If you found this collapse useful, we have full breakdowns of Pan Am, Kodak, and Sears on the can rebuild it. If you found this collapse useful, we have full breakdowns of Pan Am, Kodak, and Sears on the channel, each one a different flavor of the same disease. Companies that confuse their cost structure with their value proposition. Subscribe to Boardroom Media for more deep dives into the empires that built themselves up and then tore themselves down. Next time someone tells you a brand is too big to fail, remember Schlitz. In 1976, they were #1 in America. In 1982, they were a clearance item. 5 years. That's all it took.